I am speaking to you at a moment of grave crisis, when violent and fanatical men are attempting to destroy the unity and the freedom of Canada.
But after weeks of dangerous and unlawful activities, after weeks of people being harassed in their neighborhoods and small businesses forced to close,
As democracy flourishes in Canada,
we don't always agree, and that's okay.
because individual liberty is cherished in Canada.
Our government will always defend freedom of expression and freedom of peaceful assembly.
It has now been demonstrated to us by a few misguided persons
After evidence of increased ideologically motivated violent extremism activity across the country,
just how fragile a democratic society can be.
it became clear that local and provincial authorities needed more tools to restore order and keep people safe.
These are matters of the utmost gravity, and I want to tell you what the government is doing to deal with them.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act.
I liked him before the pandemic.
Trudeau?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, he's a handsome guy.
Yeah.
Seems sweet.
Yeah.
You know, it's like good looking guy, confident, good talker.
Yeah.
And then during the pandemic, I'm like, oh, you're a fucking dictator.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't like criticism. You're trying to shut down criticism by saying that all your critics are misogynists and racists.
Yeah.
You hear he said that about the trucking people, the truckers?
He called them.
Called them all misogynists and racists.
Oof.
Yeah, he's gross.
But Justin Trudeau, I mean, I thought he was kind of a cool guy. Then I started to read what he said. This is a couple of weeks ago. He was, or maybe this is September, but he was talking about people who are not vaccinated. He said they don't believe in science. They're often misogynistic, often racist. No, they're not.
That was not smart of him at all.
Right. He said, but they take up space. And with that, we have to make a choice in terms of a leader as a country. Do we tolerate these people? It's like, tolerate these? Now you do sound like Hitler.
No, that's...
So let's be clear. This is a defining moment in the history of Canada, in the history of the English-speaking West. The Emergencies Act is martial law. It has never been invoked in the history of that country. Now, by law, the Emergencies Act is allowed only in emergencies, in, quote, urgent and critical situations that seriously endanger the lives, health, or safety of Canadians. What's happening now does not qualify. What's happening in Canada now is not an emergency. Here's what it looked like this weekend.
I'm heading out on this traveler's road, and I won't find peace till the day we rest in harmony. Tell me what's so wrong if I choose to disagree. We're taking Highway 1 till we're living free. Fighting till we're living free. Oh, standing in unity.
On August 22nd, 1914, Canadian Parliament passed a bill to bring the War Measures Act into law. This was done to provide the federal government extraordinary powers to bypass other already existing laws in light of the First World War. It also allowed the government to bypass existing protections afforded to Canadians against their own government's overreach. The act allowed the government to legally censor information, arrest or deport Germans and Ukrainians from Canada, and to forcibly dispose of property, all to regain control of transportation, trade, and order. The act was invoked 2 more times throughout Canadian history, next during World War II, and then most famously during the FLQ crisis in the 1970s. Pierre Trudeau Sr., the Prime Minister at the time, invoked the act, which allowed Canadian authorities to arrest 450 people who allegedly assisted, conspired, or were a part of the Quebec-based domestic terror group. FLQ cells did commit kidnappings and murders, isolated to Quebec. And the invocation of then the War Measures Act was still heavily contested and criticized, as the law technically applied to every Canadian. To deal with a crisis in Quebec, the civil liberties of every Canadian were suspended.
How far would you go with that? How far would you extend that? Well, just watch me. At reducing civil liberties?
In 1988, the War Measures Act was repealed. Then Parliament passed a new law, the Emergencies Act, under the auspices that this new piece of legislation would have a much higher bar for invocation and would then conform to the newly adopted Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Or at least, that's what they told us.
I want to be very clear. The scope of these measures will be time-limited, geographically targeted, as well as reasonable and proportionate.
The Emergencies Act needs to meet a very specific threshold, which meant it could not be invoked whenever the government felt.
The responsibility of a prime minister is to make the tough calls and keep people safe.
A catastrophe or crisis at hand must rise to the Canadian Security Intelligence Service's legal definition of what constitutes a national security threat, as detailed in Section 2 of the law, which created the agency.
I believe that the invocation of the Act provided very useful tools to law enforcement.
Useful tools, but not necessary tools.
During the onset of COVID-19 and the restrictions on civil liberties which followed, the federal government debated the invocation of the Emergencies Act under a public welfare crisis. The law could only be used if all provinces declared their inabilities to deal with the pandemic. And just like we've seen, they were more than capable of keeping us safe. A pandemic, in this case COVID-19, needed to pose a threat to life and property, social disruption, or a breakdown of essential goods and services. It needed to be so hard and so difficult to deal with that no other law in Canada could stop it. Police and public health authorities would need to make the case for requiring additional, extraordinary tools not permitted under existing laws and not allowed under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That threshold for COVID was never met. The existing laws that federal and provincial governments used to deal with COVID discriminated against us based on our choices. These existing laws took us out of work, shut down our economy. These laws subjected us to outrageous fines and unjust arrests if we dared not to follow their arbitrary rules. These rules stopped our ability to travel, to cross the border, for leisure or for work.
You deserve a government that's going to continue to say, get vaccinated. And you know what? If you don't want to get vaccinated, that's your choice. But don't think you can get on a plane or a train beside vaccinated people and put them at risk.
On January 28th, the federal government deemed all unvaccinated truckers as non-essential in their cross-border deliveries after 2 years of working safely without a vaccine mandate. The federal government then applied the same mandatory 2-week quarantine on all unvaccinated truckers that everyone else who was unvaccinated faced when they entered the country without a jab. This made it logistically impossible for these truckers to work. According to the Canadian Trucker Alliance, the mandate removed 15,000 to 30,000 truckers from their jobs, which was an action that not only put our economy at risk, but thousands of Canadian families and their economic welfare as well. For months, nurses to firemen, teachers to waitresses, Canadians who lost their livelihoods protested against the vaccine mandates in cities and towns all across our country. But the vaccine mandate for truckers was the catalyst for the single largest human rights demonstration in modern Canadian history. That was the breaking point, which spawned the Freedom Convoy of late January and February 2022.
We know the way through this pandemic is by getting everyone vaccinated. And the overwhelming majority, close to 90% of Canadians, have done exactly that. The small fringe minority of people who are on their way to Ottawa or who are holding unacceptable views that they're expressing do not represent the views of Canadians who have been there for each other, who know.
Truckers from all across the country gathered in the thousands, bringing with them tens of thousands more on a transnational road trip to Ottawa. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of accounts within this story, but this will focus on the response from the federal government.
The federal government has invoked the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations.
On February 14th, the Trudeau government invoked the Emergencies Act under the Public Order section. This allowed the government to freeze bank accounts, forcibly manipulate others to do their bidding with or without their consent, to commandeer tow truck companies against the conscience rights of the owners, and to stomp on our civil liberties, quite literally in some cases. However, written within the Emergencies Act, it states that a public inquiry must follow within 60 days of the use of the law. It's a fail-safe to stop authoritarian governments from using this extraordinary power whenever they please. But it's also to determine if the invocation of the act was necessary and justified at all.
The public's legitimate right to know why the government proclaimed an emergency and whether the actions it took were appropriate.
Remember the thresholds.
My name is Brendan Miller of Foster LLP, and I am counsel to Freedom Corp, which is an organization that represents the protesters of which attended Ottawa in January and February of 2022. My colleague, Ms. Beth Sheba Vandenberg of Foster LLP, is my co-counsel on this matter, as well as the solicitors of record, both Mr. Keith Wilson, King's Counsel, as well as Ms. Eva Chipiuk, who is counsel to the convoy. With respect to sort of everyone's given an overview of the theory of their case, it is our view that there was no justification whatsoever to invoke the Emergencies Act. The Emergencies Act requires several things. One, it could be invoked due to espionage and sabotage. Are you going to hear any evidence about espionage and sabotage? The answer to that is no. Two, it could be invoked on the basis of clandestine or deceptive foreign influence, or foreign influence that involves a threat to a person. Are you going to hear evidence about that? The answer to that is no. It also could be invoked on the basis of threats or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property. Are you going to hear evidence of violence against persons or property? The answer is no. Lastly, it can also be invoked if there is a group or persons trying to destroy or overthrow by violence the system of government of Canada. Are you going to hear evidence about individuals trying to do that? The answer is no. And the answer is that there was no reasonable and probable grounds to invoke the Emergencies Act, and that the government exceeded their jurisdiction, both constitutionally and legislatively, in doing so. Thank you.
In terms of news coverage, Rebel News dominated the trucker convoy, and we did it just by being there. From British Columbia to Ottawa, we had people embedded on the ground or on the road, sharing real stories and countering the lies and propaganda from the federal colonized mainstream media.
I see a lot of cameras, a lot of independent journalists, because when people say, what do we do about the media? I say you become the media, that's what you do. The media acts like a party, the media party. It's a subsidiary of the Liberal Party. So you've got to tell the story yourselves.
It would only make sense we would do the same for the Public Order Emergency Commission, the aforementioned fail-safe tasked with examining the government's actions. We sent rebels from all over the country to cover this commission. Thanks to your support at truckercommission.com, we were able to remain until the very end.
I could feel it sort of ripples through my body, and I would feel that my nerves were still frayed. I kept hearing them like phantom horns. I kept hearing them in my head.
That's not anything to do with national security. I did not expect that. I did not expect the hearing to be what it was.
I'm heading out on this traveler's road, leaving all behind to revive my soul. And I won't find peace till the day we rest in harmony. They tell me I'm the one to blame, so they cast their stones and put me to shame. Damn your lies, you are a master in disguise. Tell me what's so wrong if I choose to disagree. We're taking how we want till we're living free. Call me what you want, I'm not what you believe. I'm just a simple man, demanding honesty. Answered my call along this road. Brothers here to read.